Since the scientific revolution of the 1920s, there has been a growing conviction that unknowing is an ineradicable part of our experience. In 1962, the American intellectual Thomas Kuhn published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which criticized Popper's theory of the systematic falsification of existing scientific theories, but also undermined the older conviction that the history of science represented a linear, rational, and untrammeled progress toward an ever more accurate achievement of objective truth. Kuhn believed that the cumulative testing of hypotheses was only part of the story. During what he called normal periods, scientists did indeed research and test their theories. But instead of reaching out toward new truth, they were, in fact, simply seeking confirmation of the scientific paradigm of the day. Teachers and texts all worked to support the prevailing orthodoxy and tended to ignore anything that challenged it. They could advance no further than the current paradigm, which thus acquired a conviction and rigidity not unlike theological dogma. But then, as had occurred during the 1920s, the normal period was succeeded by a dramatic paradigm shift. The accumulating uncertainties and puzzling results of experiments became irresistible, and scientists contended with one another to find a new paradigm. This was not a rational process. It consisted of imaginative and unpredictable flights into the unknown, all influenced by metaphors, imagery, and assumptions drawn from other fields. Kuhn seemed to suggest that aesthetic, social, historical, and psychological factors were also involved, so that the ideal of pure science was a chimera. Once the fresh paradigm had been established, a new normal period would begin, in which scientists worked to endorse the new model, disregarding hints that it was not impregnable until the next major breakthrough. It seemed that the scientific knowledge that had come upon the early modern world with the force of a new revelation was not, after all, fundamentally different from the understanding we derive from the humanities. In Knowing and Being, Michael Polanyi, a chemist and philosopher of science, argued that all knowledge was tacit rather than objectively and self-consciously acquired. He drew attention to the role of practical knowledge, which had been greatly overlooked in the modern emphasis on theoretical understanding. We learn how to swim or dance without being able to explain precisely how it is done. We recognize a friend's face without being able to specify exactly what it is that we recognize. Our perception of the external world is not a mechanical, straightforward absorption of data. We integrate a vast number of things into a focal awareness, subjecting them to an interpretive framework that is so deeply rooted that we cannot make it explicit. The speed and complexity of this integration easily outstrips the relatively ponderous processes of logic or inference. Indeed, knowledge is of little use to us until it has been made tacit. Once, Polanyi says, we have learned how to drive a car, the text of the manual is shifted to the back of the driver's mind and transported almost entirely to the tacit operations of a skill. When we learn a skill, we literally dwell in the innumerable muscular actions we perform without fully knowing how we achieve them. All understanding, Polanyi claimed, is like this. We interiorize a language or a poem and make ourselves dwell in them. Such extensions of ourselves develop new faculties in us. Our whole education operates in this way. As each of us interiorizes the cultural heritage, she grows into a person seeing the world and experiencing life in terms of this outlook. This, it has been pointed out, is not dissimilar to the Cappadocians' insistence that the knowledge of God was acquired not merely cerebrally, but by the physical participation in the liturgical tradition of the Church, which initiated people into a form of knowing that was silent and could not be clearly articulated. Pogliani argued that the scientific method is not simply a matter of progressing from ignorance to objectivity. As in the humanities, it is more likely to consist of a more complex movement from explicit to tacit knowledge. In order for their investigations to work, scientists often have to believe things that they know will be later proved wrong, though they can never be sure which of their current convictions will be so jettisoned. Because there is so much that cannot be proven, there will always be an element of what religious people call faith in science, the kind of faith that physicists showed in Einstein's theory of relativity in the absence of empirical proof. Scientific rationalism consists largely of problem-solving, an approach that does lead to systematic advance. After a problem has been solved, it can be laid aside, and scientists can move on to tackle the next. But the humanities do not function in this way, because the problems they confront, such as mortality, grief, evil, or the nature of happiness, are not capable of a once-and-for-all solution. It can take a lifetime's engagement with a poem before it reveals its full depth. This type of contemplation may function differently from ratiocination, but it is not for that reason irrational. It is like the thinking Heidegger prescribed, repetitive, incremental, and receptive. The French philosopher Gabriel Marcel distinguishes between a problem, something met which bars my passage and is before me in its entirety, and a mystery, something in which I find myself caught up and whose essence is not before me in its entirety. We have to remove a problem before we can proceed, but we are compelled to participate in a mystery, rather as the Greeks flung themselves into the rites of Eleusis and grappled with their mortality. A mystery is something in which I am myself involved, Marcel continued, and it can therefore only be thought of as a sphere where the distinction between what is in me and what is before me loses its meaning and its essential validity. It is always possible, and perhaps a modern temptation, to turn a mystery into a problem and try to solve it by applying the appropriate technique. It is significant that today a detective story based on such problem-solving is popularly known as a mystery. But for Marcel, this is a fundamentally vicious proceeding that could be symptomatic of a corruption of the intelligence. Philosophers and scientists were beginning to return to a more apophatic approach to knowledge. But the tradition of Dennis, Thomas, and Eckhart had been so submerged during the modern period that most religious congregations were unaware of it. They tended still to think about God in the modern way, as an objective reality out there that could be categorized like any other being. During the 1950s, for example, I learned by heart this answer to the question, "What is God?" in the Roman Catholic Catechism. God is the Supreme Spirit, who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections.